The rain had just started falling when Daniel parked outside the old shopping mall on the edge of town. People hurried past the entrance with shopping bags pressed against their sides, trying not to get wet. Neon lights reflected on the wet pavement, and cold wind pushed scraps of paper across the parking lot. Daniel almost didn't notice the woman sitting near the brick wall beside the mall entrance. Her head was lowered. Her coat looked too thin for the weather. A small cardboard sign rested beside her knees, shaking slightly in the wind. Then she looked up. And Daniel's entire world stopped. Because the woman begging for spare change was the same girl who had once promised to love him forever before disappearing from his life without a single goodbye. Before we begin this emotional story, welcome to Corner of Kind Choices, a place where kindness changes lives in ways we never expect. If stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. Your support helps this channel continue spreading hope, compassion, and kindness to people everywhere. Daniel Carter stood frozen beside his car while rain tapped against the roof above him. For a moment, he thought he had to be mistaken. It couldn't be her. Not after all these years. But when the woman slowly brushed wet hair away from her face, there was no doubt left. Emily Harper. The girl who had vanished 11 years earlier. The girl he once planned to marry. The girl who broke his heart so deeply that even now, after more than a decade, the pain still lived somewhere inside him. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He remembered her laugh before he remembered anything else. Warm and bright, like sunlight through open windows. Back then, they were young and poor and completely certain they would spend their lives together. They met during their sophomore year at a small community college in Ohio. Daniel worked evenings at a grocery store while Emily waited tables at a diner off Highway 7. Neither of them had much money, but somehow life felt full anyway. Friday nights meant cheap pizza and old movies. Sunday mornings meant long walks beside the river with coffee cups warming their hands. And every time Emily smiled at him, Daniel felt like the luckiest man alive. She used to tell him that kindness mattered more than success. You can survive without money, she would say. But you can't survive without good people. Daniel believed her. Emily volunteered at homeless shelters on weekends even when she barely had enough for herself. She remembered strangers' names. She tipped generously even when she couldn't afford it. She cried when she saw lonely elderly people eating alone at restaurants. She carried softness in a world that often rewarded hardness. That was the woman Daniel loved. Or at least, the woman he thought he knew. Everything changed during the winter of 2015. Emily became distant. At first it was small things. Missed phone calls. Quiet dinners. Sad eyes she tried to hide. Daniel asked her what was wrong many times, but she always smiled weakly and said she was just tired. Then one morning, she was gone. No goodbye. No explanation. Nothing. Her apartment sat empty except for one short note left on the kitchen counter. I'm sorry. That was all. Daniel searched for months. He called hospitals, old friends, co-workers, even relatives she rarely spoke to. Nobody seemed to know where she went. Eventually, life forced him forward. Painfully. Slowly. Daniel finished school, built a small construction business, and spent years trying to forget the girl who disappeared without loving him enough to explain why. But some people never fully leave your heart. And now here she was. Sitting in the rain outside a mall. Holding a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." Daniel's first feeling wasn't anger. It was heartbreak. Emily noticed him staring. At first her expression stayed blank, exhausted from whatever life had done to her. Then recognition slowly entered her eyes. Her lips parted slightly. Daniel. Her voice cracked when she said his name. He swallowed hard. Up close, she looked older than 32. Not physically older exactly, but tired in a way that life sometimes makes people tired. Her cheeks were thinner. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. But beneath all that pain, he still saw the girl he once loved. The rain grew heavier. People kept walking past her without looking twice. Daniel finally stepped closer. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. Emily looked away immediately. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The same words from the note. Daniel stared at her for several long seconds. Part of him wanted answers. Part of him wanted to walk away forever. But another part, the better part, saw a human being suffering in the cold. And kindness spoke louder than pride. "You're freezing," he said gently. "Come inside." Emily shook her head quickly. "No, it's okay." "It's not okay. I don't want your pity." Daniel looked at the cardboard sign beside her. "This isn't pity." For a second, her eyes filled with tears she clearly fought to hide. Daniel removed his coat and held it toward her. "Please." Emily hesitated before finally accepting it with trembling hands. That simple moment brought back memories Daniel thought were buried forever. He remembered wrapping blankets around her during winter movie nights. Remembered her falling asleep against his shoulder. Remembered believing love was enough to protect two people from the world. He pushed the memories away. "Come eat something," he said. Emily looked embarrassed. "You don't have to do that." "I know." After another long silence, she slowly stood. Daniel noticed how weak she seemed. Like exhaustion lived deep inside her bones. They walked together into the mall food court while rain hammered against the glass ceiling overhead. Teenagers laughed nearby. Families carried shopping bags between stores. Christmas decorations blinked above crowded tables. The normalcy of it all felt strange compared to the sadness sitting across from him. Emily barely touched her soup at first. Daniel waited patiently. Finally, she spoke. "You look good," she said softly. Daniel gave a small shrug. "Life's been okay." That wasn't entirely true. Success came eventually, but loneliness came too. He dated a few women over the years, but none of the relationships lasted. Some part of his heart had closed after Emily disappeared. And maybe he hated himself for that. "I heard you started your own business," she said. Daniel frowned slightly. "How do you know that?" Emily stared down at her cup. "I checked on you sometimes." His chest tightened again. "You vanished for 11 years. I know. You could have called." Tears gathered in her eyes instantly. "I know." Daniel looked away before his emotions overwhelmed him. Outside the food court window, children ran past laughing while parents carried holiday gifts. The world kept moving no matter how badly hearts broke. Finally, Daniel asked the question that haunted him for years. "Why did you leave?" Emily closed her eyes. For several seconds, she couldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Because I was dying." Daniel froze. "What?" Emily slowly pulled back her sleeve. Thin scars crossed her arm. "I had leukemia." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. Daniel stared at her speechless. "I found out 3 months before I left," she continued quietly. "The doctors said treatment would be long and expensive. They weren't sure if I'd survive." Daniel felt anger rising suddenly. "So you left me?" Emily cried softly now. "I didn't want you trapped in that life. That wasn't your choice to make." "I knew you," she whispered. "You would have given up everything for me." "Yes. And I couldn't let you." Daniel rubbed both hands across his face, overwhelmed. For years, he believed she abandoned him because she stopped loving him. But hearing this hurt differently. "You should have told me. I was scared." Emily wiped tears from her cheeks. "My mom had already died from cancer." I watched what it did to everyone around her. I couldn't do that to you. Daniel leaned back heavily in his chair. Part of him understood her fear. Another part still ached from the years of silence. So what happened? He asked quietly. Emily looked exhausted. The treatment worked for a while. Then the bills started piling up. I lost my apartment. Lost jobs because I kept getting sick. Eventually, she glanced down. Eventually everything fell apart. Daniel noticed how ashamed she seemed. Not ashamed of being sick. Ashamed of becoming poor. As if suffering itself were something to apologize for. That realization hurt him deeply. America could be cruel that way sometimes. People admired success but often looked away from struggle. One illness. One tragedy. One season of bad luck. That was all it took for life to collapse. How long have you been out there? He asked. A few weeks. You've been sleeping outside. Sometimes shelters. Daniel shook his head slowly in disbelief. The woman who once volunteered at homeless shelters now depended on them herself. Life had come full circle in the cruelest way possible. A little girl at the next table suddenly smiled at Emily. Your coat is pretty, she said innocently. Emily smiled softly for the first time that night. Thank you. The girl waved before returning to her mother. Daniel noticed something then. Despite everything life had done to her, Emily still carried kindness inside her. It hadn't disappeared. That mattered. After dinner, Daniel drove her to a small motel near the highway. Emily looked nervous the entire ride. You really don't have to pay for this, she said again. Daniel parked outside room 214. I know. Inside the motel office, the elderly clerk recognized Daniel immediately. Evening, Mr. Carter. Daniel rented the room for a week. Emily stood silently beside him, overwhelmed and embarrassed. Once they reached the room, she turned toward him with tears in her eyes. Why are you helping me after what I did to you? Daniel thought carefully before answering. Because honestly, he didn't fully know himself. Maybe because he still loved her. Maybe because seeing anyone suffer hurt him. Or maybe because kindness wasn't supposed to depend on whether people deserved it. Finally, he said quietly, because nobody should go through life alone. Emily began crying harder. Daniel almost hugged her. Almost. But too many years stood between them now. Get some sleep, he said gently. Before leaving, he placed a business card on the dresser. My number's there if you need anything. Emily nodded silently. Then he walked away. That night, Daniel barely slept. Rain continued tapping against his bedroom windows while old memories returned one after another. Emily dancing barefoot in their kitchen. Emily laughing beside campfires. Emily crying during sad movies. He remembered the night he bought an engagement ring. He had planned to propose beside the river where they first kissed. 3 days later, she disappeared. For years, Daniel told himself he hated her. But hatred never survives completely when love was real. By morning, his emotions felt tangled beyond understanding. At work, his employees noticed he seemed distracted. Daniel owned a respected construction company now. Nothing huge, but enough to provide stable jobs for 23 workers around Columbus. He built that company from nothing. Years of 16-hour days. Years of sacrifice. Years of proving to himself that heartbreak wouldn't destroy him. But now the past had returned wearing a torn coat outside a shopping mall. Around noon, Daniel found himself driving back to the motel. Part of him worried Emily would be gone again. But when he knocked on the door, she answered quietly. And for the first time in years, she looked rested. I wasn't sure you'd come back, she admitted. Daniel handed her a paper bag filled with groceries. You need real food. Emily laughed weakly. You always overbought groceries. You always forgot to eat. For a moment, both of them smiled at the memory. Then silence returned. The motel room felt painfully temporary. One small bed. Thin curtains. Flickering lamp. No one should live like this long term. You can't stay here forever, Daniel said carefully. I know. What's your plan? Emily looked down. I don't really have one. Daniel hated hearing that. Hopelessness had settled into her voice. He remembered when she used to dream constantly. Traveling across America. Opening a bakery. Helping foster children. Now she sounded like someone simply trying to survive one day at a time. Come work for me, Daniel said suddenly. Emily looked shocked. What? My office assistant quit 2 weeks ago. Mostly paperwork and phones. No. Daniel frowned. Why not? Because I already ruined enough of your life. You didn't ruin my life. Emily laughed bitterly. I disappeared without a goodbye. You were sick. I still hurt you. Daniel looked at her carefully. You think I'm helping you because I'm still angry. Aren't you? He considered the question honestly. I was, he admitted. For a long time. Emily nodded sadly. I deserved that. But anger gets heavy after enough years. She stared at him quietly. Daniel continued softly, and maybe kindness matters more than old pain. Those words broke something inside her. Emily covered her face and cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just the exhausted tears of someone who spent too long carrying shame alone. Daniel sat beside her carefully. You don't have to figure everything out today, he said. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Emily whispered, I missed you every single day. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Some wounds never fully heal. The following weeks changed both their lives. Emily accepted the office job reluctantly. At first she barely spoke to anyone. She moved carefully through each day like someone expecting life to collapse again at any moment. But slowly, things shifted. Daniel's employees liked her immediately. She remembered everyone's birthdays. She brought coffee for workers during long mornings. She listened when people talked. Kindness returned naturally to her, like sunlight finding its way through clouds. One afternoon, Daniel overheard Emily comforting a young employee named Marcus after he learned his father entered hospice care. She sat beside him quietly in the break room while he cried. No speeches. No fake positivity. Just presence. After Marcus left, Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. You still do that? Emily glanced up. Do what? Make people feel less alone. Her eyes softened sadly. I know what loneliness feels like now. That answer stayed with Daniel all evening. Suffering had changed her, but not in the way he expected. It made her gentler. More patient. More compassionate toward broken people. And maybe that was the strange thing about pain. Sometimes it destroys kindness. Other times it deepens it. Winter slowly faded into spring. Emily moved from the motel into a small apartment Daniel helped her find. She insisted on paying him back little by little. You're stubborn, he told her one evening. You taught me that. They both laughed softly. For the first time in years, life began feeling hopeful again. Not perfect. Not simple. But hopeful. Still, unspoken feelings lingered between them. Daniel noticed the way Emily sometimes looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Emily noticed how gently he still treated her despite everything. But fear stood between them. Too much history. Too much hurt. Then something unexpected happened. One Saturday morning, Daniel and Emily volunteered together at a downtown shelter. The shelter director had been short-staffed, and Emily asked if Daniel would help serve meals. Watching her there brought back memories of college days. She moved through the crowded room greeting people by name, listening to stories others ignored. An older homeless man named Walter sat alone near the corner. Many volunteers struggled with him because he rarely spoke kindly. Years on the street hardened him. But Emily sat beside him anyway. "You look cold," she said gently. Walter shrugged. "Winter's almost over." Emily removed her scarf and handed it to him. "You need it more than me." Walter stared at her silently. Finally he whispered, "Why are you nice to people like me?" Emily smiled sadly. "Because I know how it feels when the world stops seeing you." Daniel looked away quickly, emotions tightening in his chest. Later that afternoon, while driving home, he finally asked something he'd wondered since finding her outside the mall. "Why didn't you ask me for help?" Emily stared out the car window. "I wanted to." "Then why didn't you?" "Because people look at homeless people differently." Daniel stayed quiet. Emily continued softly, "When you lose everything, people stop seeing who you were. They only see what you became." Her voice trembled slightly. "I couldn't bear seeing that look in your eyes too." Daniel pulled the car onto a quiet side street and parked. Then he turned toward her fully. "I never stopped seeing you." Emily's eyes filled instantly. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Daniel reached over slowly and held her hand. The same hand he once dreamed of placing a wedding ring on. Emily cried quietly again. "I loved you the whole time," she whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. "So why does this still feel impossible?" "Because we're scared." She was right. Love after heartbreak feels fragile. Like holding glass after being cut before. But kindness kept bringing them back toward each other anyway. Weeks later, Daniel received a phone call that changed everything again. Emily collapsed at work. By the time Daniel reached the hospital, doctors were already running tests. Fear returned instantly. Old memories. Old nightmares. Daniel sat beside her hospital bed long after midnight. Emily looked pale but calm. "I'm okay," she whispered. "You scared me." She gave a weak smile. "Sorry." The doctor entered shortly afterward carrying results. Thankfully, the leukemia hadn't returned. But years without proper health care left Emily severely exhausted and malnourished. "She needs rest and stability," the doctor explained. Daniel almost laughed bitterly. Rest and stability. Two things life denied her for years. After the doctor left, Emily stared at the ceiling quietly. "You know what scared me most when I got sick?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not dying." She turned toward him. "Being forgotten." Daniel felt tears sting his eyes unexpectedly. "You were never forgotten." Emily smiled faintly. "Thank you for proving that." Those words broke whatever walls remained around Daniel's heart. He leaned closer carefully. "You don't have to carry life alone anymore." Emily stared at him for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Are you sure?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I think I've been sure for years." And finally, after 11 years of heartbreak, silence, loss, and pain, Emily kissed him. Softly. Carefully. Like two broken people afraid hope might disappear if they moved too quickly. But it didn't disappear. It stayed. Recovery wasn't magical after that. Life rarely works like movies. Emily still struggled with guilt. Daniel still carried scars from abandonment. Trust rebuilt slowly through ordinary days. Morning coffee together. Late night conversations. Quiet walks after dinner. Small acts of kindness became the foundation beneath them. One evening during summer, Daniel took Emily back to the river where they first kissed in college. The water glowed gold beneath sunset. Emily smiled softly. "I used to come here after I left." Daniel looked surprised. "What?" Not often. Just sometimes. She stared across the river. I'd sit here wondering if I ruined the best thing that ever happened to me. Daniel took a deep breath. You did hurt me. Emily nodded sadly. I know. But pain doesn't erase love. Tears filled her eyes again. Daniel laughed softly. You cry a lot now. I spent years trying not to. That answer hit him deeply. Sometimes survival forces people to shut down emotionally just to keep moving. And maybe healing meant learning how to feel again. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket slowly. Emily noticed immediately. Her hands covered her mouth in shock. Daniel. He smiled nervously. I bought this ring 11 years ago. Emily began crying before he even finished speaking. I kept it all this time. The small diamond caught sunset light as he held it carefully. I don't know what the future looks like, he admitted honestly. I don't know if either of us fully knows how to do this after everything. Emily nodded through tears. But I know kindness brought us back to each other when bitterness could have kept us apart forever. Daniel's voice trembled slightly. And I know I still love you. He knelt slowly beside the river. Will you marry me? Emily cried harder than ever. Yes, she whispered immediately. Yes. Daniel slid the ring onto her finger while both of them laughed and cried together beneath the fading evening sky. People often think kindness changes lives through huge dramatic moments. But usually, it happens quietly. A coat offered in the rain. A meal shared with someone ashamed. A hand held when life falls apart. Kindness doesn't always erase pain. But it reminds people they matter despite it. That truth changed Emily and Daniel forever. A year later, they married in a small outdoor ceremony surrounded by close friends, co-workers, and several people from the homeless shelter where they volunteered. Walter attended too. He wore the same scarf Emily once gave him. During the reception, Marcus raised a glass for a toast. I've worked for Daniel 6 years, he said. And one thing I learned from both him and Emily is this: kindness isn't weakness. It's courage. The room fell quiet. Marcus smiled warmly. Most people walk past suffering because it's easier. But these two stop. Daniel looked toward Emily. Tears already filled her eyes again. Everyone laughed softly. Marcus continued, and because they stopped for people, they found their way back to each other too. There wasn't a dry eye in the room afterward. Life kept moving forward after marriage. Not perfectly. Not without challenges. But differently. Together, Daniel and Emily eventually started a small nonprofit helping families facing medical debt and housing loss. Because they understood firsthand how quickly life could collapse. And because kindness feels more powerful when shared. One afternoon, nearly 3 years after Daniel found Emily outside the mall, they returned there together during Christmas season. Lights covered the entrance again. Shoppers hurried through cold weather carrying gifts. Emily stood quietly near the same brick wall where she once sat alone begging for help. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. What are you thinking about? He asked. Emily looked around slowly. That someone probably walked past me that night and never even noticed me. Daniel kissed her forehead gently. I noticed. She smiled softly. Yes, she whispered. You did. Nearby, a young homeless woman sat alone holding a sign beside the parking lot entrance. Without hesitation, Emily walked toward her. Daniel watched quietly. The young woman looked frightened at first, expecting judgment or rejection. Instead, Emily crouched beside her and spoke gently. Daniel couldn't hear the conversation from far away. But he recognized something beautiful in the moment. Pain had not turned Emily cold. It had made her compassionate. A few minutes later, Emily returned. She hasn't eaten today, she said softly. Daniel smiled. Then let's fix that. Together, They walked back across the parking lot toward the young woman. Not because kindness solves every problem instantly. Not because life suddenly becomes fair. But because every human being deserves to feel seen. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness can become the beginning of someone's second chance. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this. You never truly know what someone is carrying inside them. The quiet cashier. The lonely neighbor. The stranger sitting outside a mall in the cold. People are often fighting battles they never speak about. And one moment of compassion can change a life forever. Maybe even your own. Thank you for spending this time with Corner of Kind Choices. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes kindness still matters in this world. And remember, every small act of kindness creates ripples farther than we can see. The first snowfall of December arrived quietly over Columbus. Tiny white flakes drifted through the evening sky while Emily stood inside the kitchen watching people hurry down the sidewalks below their apartment building. The city lights reflected softly against the snow, turning everything silver and gold. Behind her, Daniel stirred soup on the stove while old jazz music played low through the apartment speakers. It had been 4 years since the night he found her outside the mall. 4 years since kindness changed both their lives forever. And yet sometimes Emily still woke up in the middle of the night afraid it had all been a dream. Trauma stayed with people that way. Even after life improved. Even after love returned. Some scars healed slowly because the heart remembered what survival felt like. "You're thinking too hard again," Daniel said gently from the kitchen. Emily smiled faintly without turning around. "How do you always know?" "Because you stare at snow like it personally offended you." She laughed softly. That sound still meant everything to Daniel. 4 years after Emily disappeared, he forgot what real laughter sounded like inside his home. Silence became normal. Empty rooms became familiar. Now the apartment felt alive again. Warm. Human. Emily walked toward the stove and wrapped her arms around him from behind. Daniel kissed her hand gently. "What's going on in that head of yours?" he asked. She hesitated. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never seeing each other again?" Daniel stopped stirring. Sometimes he thought about it too much. One different decision. One different night. One moment of walking past instead of stopping. And their story would have ended forever in that parking lot. "I think about it," he admitted quietly. Emily rested her cheek against his back. "I still remember how ashamed I felt that night." Daniel turned toward her. "You never needed to be ashamed." "But I was." Her eyes lowered slightly. "I used to sit outside that mall watching people avoid looking at me. Like if they made eye contact, they'd somehow catch my problems too." Daniel hated hearing that. Because he remembered seeing it himself after Emily returned to work and stability. The way society often treated struggling people as invisible. Or worse. As failures. "You know what hurt most?" Emily whispered. "What?" "People stopped speaking to me like I was human." Daniel pulled her closer immediately. "You are human." She nodded slowly. "But when you're homeless, people stop seeing the person. They only see the situation." The soup simmered quietly between them. Outside, snow continued falling harder. Daniel looked at the woman he loved and thought about how close pain came to destroying her softness forever. Yet somehow kindness survived inside her anyway. That still amazed him. A loud knock interrupted the moment. Emily glanced toward the door. "Were we expecting someone?" Daniel frowned slightly. "No." When he opened the door, cold wind rushed inside alongside a teenage boy wearing a grocery store uniform. "Sorry," the boy said nervously. "Are you Daniel Carter?" Daniel nodded carefully. The boy handed him a folded piece of paper. "A woman outside asked me to give you this." Then he hurried away down the hallway before Daniel could ask more questions. Emily stepped closer. "What is it?" Daniel unfolded the paper slowly. The handwriting looked rushed and shaky. "Please help me. I didn't know who else to call." Underneath the message was an address across town. Emily immediately noticed Daniel's expression tighten. "What's wrong?" He handed her the note. Emily read it twice. "No name." Daniel shook his head. Something about the message felt strange. Urgent. Afraid. Emily looked toward him carefully. "You're going, aren't you?" Daniel grabbed his coat. "I can't ignore it." Emily reached for her scarf. "Then neither can I." The address led them to a rundown apartment complex near the industrial side of the city. Broken street lights flickered above icy sidewalks while old buildings leaned tiredly against one another. The neighborhood reminded Emily painfully of places she stayed during her hardest years. Cold. Forgotten. The kind of place people only noticed when something terrible happened there. Apartment 117 sat at the end of a dim hallway. Daniel knocked softly. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Then suddenly they heard a child crying inside. Emily's face changed instantly. Daniel pushed the door carefully open. The apartment smelled faintly of mildew and cigarettes. Furniture was sparse. Half-empty food containers sat scattered across a small kitchen table. And near the couch, a little girl around 7 years old stood holding a blanket tightly against herself. Her cheeks were wet with tears. Emily immediately knelt beside her. "Hey sweetheart," she said gently. "What's your name?" The girl sniffled. "Sophie." Daniel looked around carefully. "Where's your mom?" Sophie pointed toward the bedroom silently. Emily rushed there first. A woman lay unconscious on the floor beside the bed. Daniel grabbed his phone instantly. 10 minutes later, paramedics filled the apartment while Sophie sat trembling beside Emily on the couch. "She overdosed," one paramedic explained quietly to Daniel. "Looks like painkillers." Daniel glanced toward the frightened little girl. "Is she going to survive?" The paramedic nodded slowly. "We think so." Emily held Sophie's hand the entire time. The child barely spoke. But she didn't let go of Emily once. Later that night, after child services arrived, Sophie suddenly panicked. "No," she cried loudly. "Please don't make me go alone." The social worker looked exhausted but calm. "We just need to find somewhere safe for tonight." Sophie clung desperately to Emily. "Please." Emily's eyes filled instantly. Daniel already knew what she was thinking. And honestly, he was thinking it too. The social worker sighed softly. "She has no immediate relatives available tonight." Emily looked toward Daniel carefully. He gave the smallest nod. Then Emily turned back. "She can stay with us." The social worker blinked. "You're sure?" Emily looked down at Sophie. "No child should spend the night scared and alone." An hour later, Sophie sat silently in the back seat of Daniel's truck clutching a stuffed rabbit someone from the ambulance team had given her. Snow continued falling outside while Christmas music played softly through the radio. Emily turned around from the passenger seat. "You hungry?" Sophie nodded slightly. "What's your favorite food?" The little girl hesitated before whispering, "Mac and cheese." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's convenient. Emily makes enough mac and cheese to feed an entire football team." For the first time that night, Sophie gave a tiny smile. Back at the apartment, Emily found spare blankets while Daniel cooked late-night dinner. Sophie barely spoke during the meal. But she watched Daniel and Emily carefully. Like she was studying something unfamiliar. Kindness. Safety. Warmth. Things many children sadly grow up without. Later, after Sophie fell asleep on their couch, Emily sat quietly beside Daniel near the window. She looked terrified, Emily whispered. Daniel nodded. Emily stared down at her hands. I remember that feeling. He knew exactly what she meant. Fear that life could collapse overnight. Fear of not belonging anywhere. Fear of becoming invisible. She trusts you already, Daniel said softly. Emily looked surprised. How can you tell? Because scared kids don't hold on to strangers like that unless something about them feels safe. Emily's eyes softened sadly. I wish somebody had made me feel safe when I was little. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Emily rarely talked about her childhood. But what little he knew hurt enough. Her father drank heavily after her mother died. Home became unstable. Lonely. By 16, Emily spent more time taking care of herself than being cared for. Maybe that was why she became so compassionate toward hurting people. She understood loneliness too personally. The next morning, Sophie woke early. Daniel found her standing quietly near the Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. You okay? He asked gently. She nodded. Then after a pause, she whispered, I like your tree. Daniel smiled. Emily decorated it. Sophie studied the ornaments carefully. My mom used to decorate trees. Daniel noticed how carefully she said used to. Painfully aware something in her life had changed. Children always noticed more than adults realized. Emily entered the room moments later wearing slippers and an oversized sweater. Sophie immediately relaxed seeing her. That small reaction touched Daniel deeply. Over breakfast, the social worker called with an update. Sophie's mother would remain hospitalized several more days. Temporary foster placement arrangements were being made. Emily's face fell slightly after the call ended. Daniel noticed immediately. What? She looked toward Sophie, who sat coloring quietly nearby. I don't want her thinking nobody wants her. Daniel understood. Because children blamed themselves for everything. Especially abandonment. That afternoon, Emily took Sophie Christmas shopping downtown. Not expensive shopping. Just simple things. Warm boots. A winter coat. A stuffed snowman she couldn't stop hugging. Daniel watched them laughing together across the store and felt something unexpected stirring inside him. A future. One he'd never allowed himself to imagine before. That night, after Sophie fell asleep again, Daniel finally spoke what had been quietly growing in his heart. You'd be an amazing mom. Emily froze. The room fell silent except for soft snowfall against the windows. After several seconds, Emily whispered, I don't know if I can have children. Daniel frowned slightly. What? The chemotherapy. Her voice trembled faintly. The doctors said it might have damaged things permanently. Daniel immediately took her hand. Emily looked down quickly. I never told you because, she swallowed hard. Because I thought maybe you deserved a normal life after everything. Daniel stared at her carefully. There's no version of life I want that doesn't include you. Tears filled her eyes instantly. I mean it, he continued softly. Children or no children. Emily cried quietly against his chest for a long time afterward. Sometimes kindness meant loving people beyond what they believed they could still offer. 3 days later, Sophie's mother regained consciousness. Her name was Rachel. And life had not treated her gently either. Years earlier, she injured her back working at a factory. Prescription painkillers eventually became addiction. Then came unemployment. Debt. Eviction notices. Desperation. Rachel cried the first time Daniel and Emily visited her in the hospital. I'm a terrible mother, she whispered. Emily sat beside her bed carefully. No, she said softly. You're a struggling mother. Rachel broke down completely after hearing those words. Because shame isolates people. but compassion gives them room to breathe again. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Emily helped Rachel connect with rehabilitation programs, housing support, and counseling services through their nonprofit organization. Not because saving people was easy, but because everyone deserved another chance. Especially when children were involved. One evening, while Sophie colored at their kitchen table, Rachel sat quietly with Emily drinking tea. "I need to ask you something," Rachel said nervously. Emily smiled gently. "Okay." Rachel looked embarrassed. "Why are you helping me?" Emily leaned back thoughtfully. Then she answered honestly. "Because someone once helped me when I believed my life was over." Rachel stared at her. Emily continued softly, "Kindness saved me. So now I try to pass it forward." Daniel listened quietly from the kitchen doorway. And in that moment, he realized something powerful. Emily's worst years had become the reason other people survived theirs. Pain transformed into compassion. Suffering transformed into purpose. And maybe that was one of the most beautiful things human beings could do. Christmas Eve arrived cold and bright. Snow covered rooftops across the city while church bells echoed faintly downtown. Rachel had entered rehab successfully earlier that week. Sophie would temporarily stay with relatives nearby until Rachel recovered fully. Before leaving, Sophie hugged Emily tightly near the apartment door. "Will I see you again?" she asked quietly. Emily smiled warmly. "Of course." The little girl turned toward Daniel. "And you too?" Daniel nodded. "You're stuck with us now." Sophie laughed. Then she looked up at Emily carefully. "You feel like home." Emily's face crumpled instantly with emotion. After Sophie left, the apartment felt strangely quiet. Daniel found Emily crying softly near the Christmas tree. "She'll be okay," he whispered. Emily nodded. "I know." But Daniel sensed something deeper inside her tears. A longing she rarely admitted aloud. He wrapped his arms around her from behind while soft lights glowed across the room. "You know," he said carefully, "there are a lot of kids out there who need people exactly like you." Emily turned slowly. "What are you saying?" Daniel smiled gently. "I'm saying maybe we should think about adoption someday." For a moment, Emily simply stared at him. Then tears flooded her eyes again. "You mean that?" "With my whole heart." She kissed him immediately. Outside, snow continued falling over the city while warm light filled their apartment windows. And somewhere nearby, another lonely person was probably wondering if anyone still cared about them. That was the thing about kindness. Most people never realized how close they came to changing someone's life forever. A conversation. A meal. A second chance. Love often began in the smallest moments. And sometimes the people who suffered most became the ones who healed others best. Months later, Rachel celebrated 6 months sober. Sophie visited Daniel and Emily almost every weekend. And slowly, life began rebuilding itself around all of them. Not perfectly, but honestly. One spring afternoon, Daniel found Emily sitting outside their nonprofit office watching volunteers unload food boxes for struggling families. Children laughed nearby while sunlight warmed the sidewalks. "You look happy," he said. Emily smiled softly. "I am." Then after a pause, she added quietly, "For a long time I thought my story ended outside that mall." Daniel sat beside her. "But kindness gave you another chapter." She leaned against him gently. "No," she whispered. "It gave us one." Spring arrived slowly that year. The last traces of winter melted from sidewalks across Columbus while trees began filling with fresh green leaves again. Warm air drifted through open windows, and for the first time in months, people lingered outside instead of rushing from cold to shelter. Inside the nonprofit office Daniel and Emily had built together, volunteers moved boxes of donated groceries while phones rang steadily in the background. The organization had grown far beyond what either of them expected. What began as a small effort to help families facing medical debt and housing loss had become a lifeline for hundreds of people across the city. And somehow, every single day reminded Emily of the night kindness saved her life too. She stood near the front desk organizing paperwork when a nervous young man entered carrying a sleeping baby against his chest. He looked exhausted. Scared. The kind of tired that lived deeper than lack of sleep. Emily immediately recognized it. "Hi," she said gently. "Can I help you?" The man hesitated before nodding. "My name's Tyler." His voice cracked slightly. "I lost my apartment last week." Emily guided him toward a chair carefully so he wouldn't wake the baby. "What's her name?" she asked softly. Tyler looked down at the little girl sleeping against him. "Lily." Emily smiled warmly. "She's beautiful." Tyler's eyes filled unexpectedly. "You're the first person who said that all week." Those words hit Emily harder than he realized. Because when people struggle financially, society often stops treating them like full human beings. Conversations become colder. Compassion disappears. People start speaking to struggling parents like they're failures instead of exhausted human beings trying to survive. Emily leaned forward slightly. "Tell me what happened." Tyler took a shaky breath. His wife had died 8 months earlier after complications during surgery. Medical bills buried him in debt. He fell behind on rent while trying to care for Lily alone. Eventually, eviction came. Now he worked double shifts delivering packages while sleeping in his truck with a 6-month-old baby. By the time he finished speaking, he looked ashamed just for existing. Emily hated that look. She remembered wearing it herself years ago. "You did the right thing coming here," she said quietly. Tyler laughed bitterly. "I almost didn't." "Why?" He stared at the floor. "People get uncomfortable around poor people." Emily's chest tightened. "Because he wasn't wrong." Daniel entered the office carrying coffee cups just in time to hear the last sentence. Without hesitation, he handed Tyler one of the coffees. "You're not making anybody uncomfortable," Daniel said calmly. Tyler looked stunned by the simple kindness. Sometimes suffering made people expect rejection everywhere. And small compassion felt enormous because of it. Over the next several hours, Daniel and Emily worked quickly to arrange temporary housing for Tyler and Lily through local church partners. By evening, Tyler stood near the office doorway holding his daughter while tears filled his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." Emily smiled softly. "You don't have to." "No," Tyler whispered. "You don't understand." He looked down at Lily sleeping peacefully. "This morning I thought my life was over." Daniel stepped closer. "It's not over." Tyler nodded slowly. Then before leaving, he asked quietly, "Why do you both care so much?" Daniel glanced toward Emily. And honestly, the answer lived in both of them now. Because they understood how close ordinary people could come to losing everything. Because pain taught them compassion instead of cruelty. Because kindness once rescued them too. Emily answered gently. Because everyone deserves someone who doesn't give up on them. After Tyler left, the office grew quieter as volunteers headed home. Daniel noticed Emily staring out the front window thoughtfully. "What's on your mind?" She smiled faintly. "I was thinking about how many people walk around carrying invisible pain." Daniel nodded. "And how much courage it takes to ask for help." Emily looked toward him carefully. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "The hardest part of being homeless wasn't hunger." Daniel stayed quiet. "It was feeling invisible." Her voice softened. "People would look through me like I wasn't even there." Daniel moved closer immediately. Emily continued quietly, "That's why I try so hard to really see people now." He touched her hand gently. "And you do." That evening, They walked home through downtown streets glowing with sunset light. Couples filled outdoor restaurants. Children chased each other through public fountains. Music drifted from nearby bars and cafes. Ordinary life surrounded them. But Emily still noticed people others ignored. The elderly man eating dinner alone near the bus stop. The exhausted waitress rubbing her swollen feet outside a diner. The teenager crying quietly on a bench while pretending to scroll through his phone. Pain existed everywhere once you learned how to recognize it. Near the corner of 5th Street, Emily suddenly slowed down. A young woman sat against a brick wall holding a cardboard sign beside her backpack. Daniel immediately noticed the familiar look in Emily's eyes. Compassion mixed with memory. The young woman couldn't have been older than 21. Her hair looked unwashed. Dark bruises shadowed beneath her eyes from exhaustion. Most pedestrians passed without making eye contact. Emily walked directly toward her. "Hi," she said softly. The woman looked startled. Almost suspicious. Like kindness itself felt unfamiliar now. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Emily crouched beside her. "Nothing." The woman blinked in confusion. Daniel stood nearby while traffic moved steadily around them. "What's your name?" Emily asked. "Maya." "I'm Emily. This is my husband Daniel." Maya glanced down quickly. "You don't need to pretend to care." Those words carried years of disappointment behind them. Emily understood instantly. People had probably promised help before. Then disappeared. "You hungry?" Daniel asked gently. Maya hesitated before nodding slightly. 20 minutes later, they sat together inside a small diner near downtown. Maya ate carefully at first, like someone afraid the food might suddenly be taken away. Emily remembered that feeling too. Eventually, Maya relaxed enough to talk. She had aged out of foster care months earlier. Lost her job after getting sick. Then lost housing shortly afterward. No family. No support system. No safety net. Just survival. "You know what's funny?" Maya said quietly while stirring her coffee. "People always say America gives everybody a chance." Daniel leaned back silently. Maya laughed bitterly. "But if you start with nobody, sometimes one bad month destroys everything." Emily saw tears gathering behind a young woman's eyes despite how hard she fought them. "You don't have nobody anymore," Emily said gently. Maya stared at her in disbelief. That single sentence broke something inside her. She covered her face and cried quietly right there in the diner booth. Not dramatic sobbing. Just exhausted tears from carrying life alone too long. Daniel looked away briefly, emotions tightening in his chest again. Because every time Emily helped someone hurting, he remembered finding her outside that mall years earlier. And every time, he silently thanked God he stopped walking that night. Over the following weeks, Maya began working part-time through the nonprofit office while staying in temporary housing nearby. She remained guarded at first. Trauma made trust difficult. But Emily stayed patient. One afternoon, Maya finally asked the question that had clearly lived inside her for weeks. "Why do you understand me so well?" Emily looked up from her paperwork. Then after a long pause, she answered honestly. "Because a few years ago, I was sitting outside a mall holding a cardboard sign too." Maya froze completely. "What?" Daniel smiled softly from across the office. Emily nodded. "I know how fast life can fall apart." Maya stared at her with wide eyes. "But, you seem so normal." Emily laughed warmly. "That's because homelessness can happen to almost anybody." The room fell quiet. Then Emily added softly, "People struggling aren't different from everyone else. They're just people going through pain." Maya cried again after hearing that. Not from sadness this time. From relief. Relief that someone finally understood her without judgment. Summer arrived bright and humid. And with it came another unexpected change. One Saturday morning, Daniel found Emily sitting on their apartment balcony holding a pregnancy test with trembling hands. For a moment, he couldn't even speak. Emily looked stunned. Terrified. Hopeful. "I thought this couldn't happen," she whispered. Daniel crossed the balcony in seconds. "Are you serious?" Emily nodded slowly. Then both of them laughed and cried at the same time. After years believing chemotherapy stole that possibility forever, life surprised them anyway. Daniel dropped to his knees beside her chair and pressed his forehead gently against her stomach. Emily ran trembling fingers through his hair. "We're really doing this," she whispered. Daniel looked up with tears in his eyes. "Yeah," he said softly. "We are." The pregnancy wasn't easy. Emily's previous health struggles meant constant doctor appointments and careful monitoring. Fear returned often. Sometimes in quiet moments late at night. Sometimes after difficult test results. Sometimes simply because happiness felt fragile after everything they survived. One evening during her second trimester, Emily sat awake beside the bedroom window while rain tapped softly against the glass. Daniel noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" She looked down at her hands. "I'm scared." He moved beside her quietly. "About the baby. What if something happens?" Daniel wrapped his arms around her carefully. Emily's voice trembled slightly. "I spent so many years losing things." He understood. When people survive trauma, joy often feels dangerous. Because loving deeply means risking pain again. Daniel kissed her forehead softly. "You don't have to carry fear alone anymore." Emily closed her eyes. "I'm trying to believe that." "You already are." Months later, during a community fundraiser organized by their nonprofit, something beautiful happened. Tyler arrived carrying little Lily, who now toddled happily around the event holding balloons. Rachel attended too, proudly celebrating nearly 2 years sober. Sophie ran through the park laughing with other children. And Maya stood helping serve food beside Emily while sunlight warmed the crowded gathering. At one point, Daniel stepped back quietly just to watch everything. Lives intersecting. People healing. Kindness multiplying outward in ways impossible to measure. Emily walked over slowly, one hand resting against her pregnant stomach. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Daniel smiled emotionally. That one moment changed everything. She followed his gaze across the park. Tyler laughing with Lily. Rachel helping volunteers organize supplies. Maya smiling genuinely for perhaps the first time in years. People who once felt abandoned now finding community. Emily leaned gently against him. "Kindness spreads," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "Yes, it does." Then suddenly, Sophie tugged excitedly on Emily's hand. "Miss Emily." Emily laughed. "What?" Sophie grinned widely. "Your baby just kicked." Everyone nearby burst into laughter. Emily smiled through tears while Sophie pressed both hands carefully against her stomach again. The little girl's eyes widened dramatically. "I felt it." Rachel watched nearby crying quietly herself. Because she knew better than anyone how close she came to losing both herself and her daughter forever. And now here they all stood together beneath summer sunlight. Broken people becoming family. That night after the fundraiser ended, Daniel and Emily returned home exhausted but happy. City lights glowed softly beyond their apartment windows while distant traffic hummed below. Emily changed slowly into comfortable clothes before sitting carefully beside Daniel on the couch. The baby kicked again immediately. Daniel laughed softly and placed his hand against her stomach. "Still amazing every time." Emily rested her head against his shoulder. "You know what I realized today?" "What?" "We almost never see the full impact of kindness." Daniel looked down at her. Emily smiled faintly. If you hadn't stopped for me that night outside the mall. Her voice trailed off. But Daniel understood. There would be no nonprofit. No helping Tyler. No helping Maya. No helping Rachel and Sophie. No baby growing between them now. One act of compassion created ripples through countless lives. Daniel kissed the top of her head gently. You saved me too, he whispered. Emily looked up surprised. How? He thought carefully before answering. 4 years after you disappeared, I stopped believing people stayed. Emily's expression softened painfully. But loving you again taught me something. What? That broken things can heal. Tears filled her eyes immediately. Outside, rain began falling softly over the city. And inside that small apartment, two people who once believed life had ended for them sat together dreaming about the future instead. Months later, on a cold November morning, Emily gave birth to a little girl. Daniel cried before he even held the baby. She had Emily's eyes. The same warm eyes that once looked at strangers with compassion even while carrying unbearable pain herself. Emily looked exhausted but radiant lying in the hospital bed. Daniel sat beside her holding their daughter carefully. What should we name her? He whispered. Emily smiled weakly. Grace. Daniel's eyes filled again. Grace Carter, he repeated softly. And somehow the name felt perfect. Because Grace was exactly what brought them back to each other. Grace was what kindness looked like when someone chose compassion over bitterness. Grace was stopping for a stranger in the rain. Grace was believing people deserved second chances. Grace was love surviving heartbreak. A nurse quietly watching nearby wiped tears from her own eyes. Sometimes human stories touched even strangers. Late that night after visitors left and the hospital room grew quiet, Emily held baby Grace against her chest while city lights flickered beyond the window. Daniel sat beside them both unable to stop smiling. Emily looked toward him softly. Do you think she'll understand someday? Understand what? How much kindness changed her life before she was even born? Daniel touched Grace's tiny hand gently. We'll teach her. Emily smiled. And somewhere deep inside herself, the shame she carried for years finally loosened completely. Because she understood something now. Your worst chapter does not define your whole story. Sometimes the people who feel most forgotten become the reason others survive. Sometimes love waits patiently through impossible years. And sometimes one small act of kindness becomes the beginning of an entirely new life. Not just for one person, but for generations after them. So if you're listening to this story tonight while carrying your own pain, remember this. People can heal. Lives can rebuild. And kindness matters far more than most of us realize. The person you stop to help today may someday help countless others tomorrow. Because compassion spreads. Hope spreads. Love spreads. And no act of genuine kindness is ever truly wasted.